Okay, so today we are talking about this series that we're in that's really about happiness. And you've made this really great point that happiness is a little bit about a balance between giving and receiving. And last time we identified 4 areas where we can find more balance in giving and receiving. Do you want to tell us what those 4 areas are and what we're going to talk about today?
Right, and they're just ways of kind of getting our head around the breadth for which receiving and giving. And I love kind of beginning with this receiving, because I think we always begin with receiving. We can't give what we haven't received. For instance, if we have no money, we have nothing to give. We have to somehow get the money first. So I love just the framing of saying that it's all about this rhythm of receiving and giving, that we receive, and out of what we receive, we're able to give. And it's that rhythm that creates happiness. So the 4 categories, and they're certainly not exhaustive, but they're categories that will help us talk about it. Time, it's receiving and giving. How does that play into how we spend our time? Our talent, our money, and our heart. And those are 4 kind of different ways of thinking about things. But it's hopefully a framework that's going to help us think about all of the areas. For instance, relationships are a mix of the receiving and giving that we do with time and talent, maybe even with money, certainly our heart. So it plays into all areas of our life. But we're going to talk about these 4 areas as ways that we can grow in our perspective on how they can lead us to happiness in receiving and giving.
Yeah, and we talked about how most of us are a little off balance that way with giving and receiving. And I think it's helpful to think about, first of all, that everyone is off balance in one of these ways. And they kind of have root causes for why we're off balance. For example, if you tend to be someone who is not balanced enough in the giving and you're more focused on receiving, you may have at the root of that a bit of a scarcity mentality about life. Like there isn't enough out there, and so I've got to get what's mine and hold on to it.
Right, yeah.
And whereas if you're the other way around, you might have a scarcity mentality about people you love in the world being okay, or you might be afraid about things in the world. So you're always giving what is yours away to make sure other people are okay, because you need that sense of safety. And it's helpful to identify where you're coming from without judgment, to know kind of what the source of the scarcity is for you, because that's where the blockage comes in without giving and receiving in an imbalanced way.
Yeah, and I want to come back to that scarcity abundance, because I think that's so powerful and part of this whole framework. But it's also to mention that we go through seasons, and there are seasons where the receiving might be the most important thing that we're doing. We're doing less giving because we're in a season that we need to focus on being able to receive. And then conversely, there are seasons that are wired towards giving. And in the book I wrote a couple of years ago, Space to Breathe Again, I had a chapter on work-life balance, and I reframed it as work-life dance. Because that idea of the imperfection, that we don't achieve this perfect balance, but it's this dance between receiving and giving, or work life. It's this moving in and out, and it's this rhythm that we want to create more than it is this equal balance that we get to.
Yeah, but it is pretty helpful to note about yourself which side you tend to lean on, because I think one comes super naturally and easily to us. So it's easy to get off balance that way.
Yes.
And the other one might be counterintuitive. But I think what we'll find is that when we lean that other way, in the way that's counterintuitive, whether it's giving or receiving, we will notice a certain measure of health in our life and we will just feel better because we're
Yes.
meant to be more balanced, and we all are probably off balance.
Yeah, and I love what you brought up last episode, this concept of abundance and scarcity, because almost always the problems that we struggle with in any one of these areas could be traced back to some sense of a scarcity mentality, that we're struggling with it because it feels like whatever that area that we're going to run out of something. And I think that idea and the powerful concept that is in the Bible and that I've come to believe more and more is this abundance mentality, that there's plenty of time or whatever the resource is, and that even take it a step further, that abundance mentality, that when we give, it isn't just that there's enough, but that there's a multiplication effect. And we'll talk about this more in these various areas. But that idea that it's something happens which we can't even explain, that when we're willing to really live into this receiving and giving, the whole thing kind of just explodes. It gets bigger and bigger and multiplies more and more instead of running out of it. So we'll get into that a lot as we talk about these areas.
Yeah, and I mean, this is just an observation, and I think it's super mysterious how this works, but if you have a scarcity mentality, that ends up becoming true in your life. You end up not having enough in the thing that you believe there's a scarcity of. And it's almost like you create that reality. And when you have an abundance mentality, like you're saying, there's a multiplying effect. When you believe in abundance, even in areas where you're in need, there ends up being an abundance. And you view other people with that generosity, whether it's in time, talent, money, or heart. And when you have scarcity in those four areas, then you tend to view other people as if they're taking from you and you have to protect it.
Absolutely.
So it's a real risk, though, to transition from the areas where we feel areas of scarcity to abundance. And that's a real risk. It's almost like a muscle we have to practice using. So let's talk about each of those four areas.
Right.
So let's start with talents. And how can we think abundantly about talents in our lives?
Well, that's great. I think the starting point is a place that may rub some of us the wrong way. We may have a hard time with it, but I do believe that if we understand it rightly, it's true. And that's that everyone has talents, has very specific God-given talents. And I think that the scarcity mentality sometimes begins with the thought that I don't have anything to give. I'm not one of those superstars, those charismatic, gifted people out there. And so I need to just stay in the background because I don't really have anything to offer. So if you think about it, they're saying, in essence, I don't have anything to give. And if happiness is to be found in the receiving and the giving, and you fundamentally don't believe you have anything to give, you're already behind the 8 ball.
So you're saying that some of us don't really believe that we have talents. Do you think that's because we have a narrow definition of talents? Like when we talk about talented people, they tend to be people that stand out in sports or in music or some kind of thing that other people observe and find noteworthy. But that's not the kind of talents we're talking about, right?
Well, it's one form of it.
Yeah.
But I think you're right. I think one half of the problem is that we have way too narrow an understanding of what it means to have gifts, to have talents.
Mm-hmm.
The other side is I think that we have a hard time sometimes admitting that we're good at things. And sometimes that's because we've never allowed certain pieces of ourselves, which we are very talented in, to grow and to blossom. And so we have, because we've never given in those areas, they stay under the surface and they never are brought to even our own realization of it. So, but those are two different things. But I do think that talent is, in using that word, is so much broader than what we typically think of. We think of artistic talent or musical talent, or that person's like incredibly smart, or they're charismatic, they're a great speaker, or they're very athletic. And those are real talents. But people have these incredibly intuitive relational skills, which we don't name as easily. Or they might have these great skills at being able to see the landscape around them and understand and conceptualize things, or any number of things which are so much less obvious. But if we could come to name those things, then that would give us the path to begin to live into those things and to grow and multiply those talents. So that's a challenge. And for people who perhaps struggle with that, the first place to begin is almost accepting by faith that God gave you gifts, that God gave you talents, that God didn't leave people out of the equation.
I love that. I mean, the miracle of like just a human being, a human body, is so amazing, and that there are in each one of us these talents. And once we believe that, then we can start to look for it. And when we look for it, I mean, these are just a couple of things I've noticed about cultivating and finding your talent, or not your talent, but just things that your strengths, and there can be multiple ones. But it typically, something that you are really good at comes a little bit easier for you than it does for other people, but you also tend to think of it as not really that remarkable.
Exactly.
You take it for granted because you've sort of always been able to do it.
And you kind of think it really would come easily to anybody because it's easy.
Yeah, it's easy for me.
Just easy for me.
And I also find that when looking for what your strengths are, you usually want someone else's strength, and it doesn't come easily to you, and the one that does come easily to you take for granted.
Yeah.
I also find things that we're good at, we will naturally enjoy. So looking for things that you enjoy, looking for things that come easily to you when other people, and you don't think it's remarkable. I also think that our talents and gifts, and again, we're talking really broad swaths about what this means, not just like music, arts, athletics, but our talents, we have them in us. They're given to us because they are additive and useful to the world. And
Exactly.
They can be additive and useful to other people in terms of relationships, in terms of bringing beauty into the world and order. I mean, anything that you do that helps relationships form and be strengthened, anything that you do that brings order and beauty into the world, anything that is useful, those are things that maybe the broader world doesn't celebrate as like a huge talent or gift. But those are worth taking note of because they are going to bring us a lot of joy, and they're going to, when we start to exercise them, we are strengthening that muscle of giving and receiving our talents. And people will be blessed by what we give, and it will be lacking if we're not bringing it to the table.
It's absolutely true. And I think it again, it highlights kind of the framework of this series, that it's about both sides of receiving and giving. And if we don't give, what happens is we become bottled up. And one of the really honest reasons why I wanted to relaunch this podcast is for that very reason. I found in that year of Jubilee, that was kind of a sabbatical from the constant giving, that I kept on coming up with all these ideas, and I didn't have any outlet for giving. And that not having an outlet almost felt like it was bottling up in me, and it needed a place to be able to give out. So this podcast is really for my sake in terms of the whole thing, but that's the way it works. We give, and then you get excited, and it brings this incredible joy, happiness to us. And then it blesses others, and we receive from that. And then it creates this snowball multiplication effect. But living into who God made us to be, to the gifts He created us to have, is so critical to having a happy, joyous, fulfilled life.
Well, and I appreciate what you said about like your year of sabbatical, because I know you were reading a lot of books. So you had a lot of information coming in, but you had nowhere to export it, if you will. You had nowhere to put it out. And what you enjoy doing, which is this, we've got Joe back there doing his deal, his production, and the three of us have this little team, and we all really enjoy it. And it's fun, but I also think, to your point, it's not just fun for you, it is additive to others, hopefully. So that's a really great thing to think about. I want to sidebar just for a minute and talk about exploiting our talents and how we can exploit our own talents, and we can exploit other people's talents. I think particularly this is something that's happening with raising kids right now, is we find what our children are good at, and then we pour so much into that because it becomes about their identity. And that's such an important thing to remember, is that our talents are meant to be given and received. They're not meant to be who we are.
Right. And unfortunately, sometimes people's talents are really just a disguised means of getting from others. I give to someone, whether it's speaking so that I can get affirmation, or I do all of this for my kids because it's a reflection on me. And so I do think absolutely it's a great point that at the core, underneath receiving and giving, is this idea that we serve others. That we're giving for others' sake, not for our own sake, or else it's not really giving. So. Yeah,
and I'm not really sure. It's just like something to keep in the back of your mind. This idea of over harvesting. I think kids sometimes who are great at things, we over harvest their talents, and it becomes this meritocracy where we value human beings based on what they're good at.
Yeah.
And that in and of itself can get off balance.
Yeah.
So I love that, but. That's why I think it's helpful to think about our talents and balancing them in terms of giving and receiving in this broader context outside of sort of the things that we idolize in the world, music, athletics, intelligence. And we learn to think about skills that we have that we find unremarkable that are actually contributing to our communities.
Right. And I think one of the ways of moving in that direction is also the receiving side of talents. What does that mean to be receiving when we're talking about talents? And I think that understanding and having the correct balance dance between receiving and giving with talents is a real corrective to that exploitation that you're talking about. So there are a few things that I think of when I think of receiving when it comes to talents, which are incredibly powerful and important if if we want to be abundant in this area of talent. The first one I think of is that whatever our talent is, or talents are that we're wanting to be receiving and giving in, we have to have a mindset of being a constant learner. That is, none of us are so far down a path of being good at something that we don't have massive amounts to learn from other people. And I love, my passion in life is teaching. And when I wrote a mission statement 30 years ago about that, when I realized that in order to be a teacher that's worth anything to anybody else, I had to be a constant learner and a voracious listener. That if I didn't do that, then I would be giving out of a shallow pool. There wouldn't be anything there. And so I realized whatever it is that you or anyone else identifies and says, I think this is a talent I have or a gift I have from God or otherwise, however you might think about it. It's, what can I do actively, intentionally to learn and to grow this area of talent? We don't come at 100% with it.
Yeah, and there's risk in stepping out there, especially because so many of us don't even want to admit that we are talented or that we have some talent. And so taking a risk to develop and cultivate it means that you have to believe that you have been given this talent. So that's a way of receiving. What are some other ways that we can receive if we feel like we don't have talent and we want to cultivate it? What are some ways that we can kind of have the input in, and so then it makes it easier for the output?
Well, one of the great, really critical ways, because no matter what our talents are, we're going to quickly become aware of our inadequacies relative to that talent.
Sure.
So one of the powerful concepts I think around this is embracing the idea of team. And this podcast is a good example. I love to teach, but it's the team of you who can bring out all sorts of things in conversation and add so much on that end. And Joe, who's helping out with all of the technical pieces and getting this out. If I was trying to do it all, no matter what my gift or talent is in teaching, it would be far, far less. And so if we take this idea of we have a talent and then we think, how can I multiply that talent by partnering and co-laboring with the right people who can add substance and color to this? It's incredible. And every talent needs people around it. No one is intended to be alone, to be a superstar by themselves.
I really get into this concept of team because I think having a team makes everything more fun. It takes the pressure off. And even if, say, your talent is an individual thing, like say you're an artist or a writer or an individual athlete or you work alone, there's this concept of body doubling when you work alongside someone else who is also doing work alone. And there's an exponential effect in terms of your attention and your efficiency. And I'm friends with a good number of writers, and all of them really benefit from having this cohort of other writers where they're like reading and spinning off each other's ideas. And if you think about all these great writers throughout history, they were always in these communities of other people doing their individual work and their individual talent. So I think, we have this awesome team, which makes everything so exponentially better.
And a lot more fun.
And a lot more fun. And I think individuals do too. So that's a great concept to take away. Once you start to lean into what your talent is, how can you do it as a team?
Yeah.
And I even remember this thing that mothers used to do back in the day when any of us had time to cook, but they would get together and make a big chunk of food at the same time together, and it made it more fun, and we would share and everyone would do a part. And I just think that's a great idea, and it's a great way of taking these tedious things that we don't want to do and making them more fun.
Yeah, I love that concept of body doubling. It's great, and it's a great kind of practice of embracing team. So you have we're going to do this in community, and then you have also this idea of I'm going to leverage other people's talents that in combination with mine makes 1 plus 1, 10.
Yeah.
So I think that's a really powerful way to grow and to engage and live into our talents. The final one, which I believe so deeply in, as a person for whom faith is the center of my life, is that we also partner and we co-labor with God with our talents. And as a Christian, I believe that when I choose to live boldly and live into who God created me to be and the talents that he gave me, that he multiplies that tremendously. It's just like the story in the Bible of the boy who brought a couple of fish, which maybe that boy caught, and Jesus multiplied. So I love that idea, and I do believe so much that in some mysterious, undefinable way, God multiplies talents.
Yeah, I totally agree with what you're saying about God and how important God is in the aspect of receiving. And one of the things I've noticed is that whenever we are exercising our talent, what comes alongside of it is this kind of selfishness. Like they say, where your talent is, sometimes there is your greatest weakness. And our weaknesses are always right there whenever we're working out our talent or using it. And one of the things I found about employing spiritual prayer and inviting God into what we do is that God helps lift us out of ourselves. He lifts us up from having it be something that we need or having, worrying about how we come off. And I have found that I am incapable of doing that on my own, of lifting myself out of my weakness. But that is something that God does do for us when we exercise talents, especially when we're doing it not for selfish gain, but for the benefit of others.
Well, and if we're the least bit self-aware, when those times happen, we have to admit that something happened that was bigger than us.
Yeah, and we can easily tell ourselves, oh, we shouldn't do this thing that we're good at because it's, because of this weakness that comes out. And I feel like that's something that I've learned, that whenever I have that doubt in my mind that's saying, like, go sit on the bench, you shouldn't be doing this, to really just fight back against that mentality, because God, when we are doing things that blesses others, promises to equip us with what we need and lifts us out of our sort of selfish ways.
Yeah. Well, this is great. Well, I want to just share one quote. I read it actually this morning, unintentionally relative to this podcast, but it shares this idea that God comes alongside of and multiplies our talents, and it's from a man named Samuel Shoemaker. And he wrote, "Something comes into our own energies and capacities and expands them. We are laid hold of by something greater than ourselves. We can face things, create things, accomplish things that in our own strength would have been impossible. The Holy Spirit seems to mix and mingle his power with our own, so that what happens is both a heightening of our own powers and a gift to us from outside." And I think that's an amazing experience. That's kind of the ultimate of what we're talking about with this receiving and giving and talents, that not only as we partner with others to heighten our talents, but as we partner with God, we're lifted to this multiplication, this exponential type of thing that happens, that is one of the most amazing experiences of joy and satisfaction and fulfillment. So these are things we need to believe by faith. They're I can't prove them. I've experienced them, but I can't prove them.
I really see that multiplying effect, and it kind of goes back full circle to what we were talking about, this abundance mentality.
Yes.
That when you believe there is an abundance, and when you enact that abundance through these three things that we talked about, just to sum it up, we talked about believing that you have a talent and kind of looking for that in ways that you enjoy, in ways that you have noticed have benefited others, and you might not even think it's that remarkable. Believing that you have a talent, looking for the team, and the team aspect of exercising our talents brings joy and makes things more impactful. And then thirdly, believing that the Holy Spirit or God really multiplies what we're doing and being open to that. Do you have any other takeaways?
No, I think that's great. My encouragement is to do this. That this is not something that we'll understand just by thinking about it and convincing ourselves intellectually. We need to live into it, and we need to practice and take risks, as you say. And so my encouragement would be to talk to others, to look for that sense of who God made you to be, and to take the risk to live into that with others and with God.